Shulevitz. I'm going to be asking Andrew Solomon some questions after his talk, but he's going to give a talk. Here's how it's going to work. He's going to talk for about 25 minutes. Then I'll ask him some questions for up to 10 minutes, and then we'll turn the floor over to you. I actually think this is a situation in which the cliche is true. Andrew really doesn't need an introduction, but I will give him one nonetheless. As far as I'm concerned, the most salient point about Andrew is he was my classmate in college and one of the most entertaining, brilliant, and unusual people any of us knew. I don't think I would have predicted that he would move in this particular direction, but it's wonderful that he has. Andrew is the author of works of fiction as well as nonfiction, though I think probably we have possibly heard more about his nonfiction. He wrote a book called, I don't know the dates of these, so if you want to supply them, you can. In the 90s, I would say, he wrote a book called The Irony Tower, which is about avant-garde Soviet artists. Did I get that right? A novel called The Stone Boat after that. The Noonday Demon, which is about his own battles with, and of course other people's battles with, depression, which won the National Book Award, I believe. And most recently in 2012, Far from the Tree. I don't remember the subtitle. I was going to hold it up, but I left it over there in my bag. But what's that? There we go. Parents, Children, and the Search for Identity. Fabulous. Thank you very much. A book which I could attempt to describe in a line, but I won't bother because Andrew is going to tell you about it, and he'll do a much better job than I could. So I turn it over to you, Andrew.
Well, it's delightful to be here at Kent Presents. Shame we couldn't get nicer weather, but otherwise a splendid occasion. Even in purely non-religious terms, homosexuality represents a misuse of the sexual faculty. It is a pathetic little second-rate substitute for reality, a pitiable flight from life. As such, it deserves no glamorization, no rationalization, and above all, no pretense that it is anything but a pernicious sickness. That's Time magazine in 1968, when I was 5 years old. And as all of you know, this spring the Supreme Court ruled in favor of a constitutionally protected right to gay marriage. And I set out to write Far from the Tree, wanting to understand how that happened. How did we get from the position that this characteristic was universally understood to be an illness to a position in which it is universally understood to be an identity? And if that shift was possible for homosexuality as it turned into gayness, then I wondered for what other things it was possible for an illness to turn into an identity. When I was about 6 years old, so shortly after that piece ran, I was with my mom in New York City and my brother, and we had gone to buy shoes at Indian Walk Shoes on Madison Avenue. Some of you doubtless remember. I'm not sure that name would go down so well today. And the salesman, after he had given us our shoes, told us that each of us could have a balloon to take home. And my brother wanted a red balloon, and I wanted a pink balloon. And my mother said that she thought I'd really rather have a blue balloon. And I said, no, I really wanted the pink one. And she reminded me that my favorite color was blue. The fact that my favorite color now is blue, but I'm still gay, will give you some feeling for a mother's influence and its limits. When I was growing up, my mother used to say, the love for your children is like no other feeling in the world. And until you have children, you don't know what it feels like. And when I was little and she said that, I took it as the greatest possible compliment. It meant that bringing up my brother and me had been the real joy of her life. And when I was a little bit older and she said it, it made me anxious. And I thought, but I think I'm gay. And if I'm gay, I probably won't be able to have children. And after I came out, when she said it made me angry. And I said, you know, that's not the path I'm on. And I want you to stop saying that. But she never did. The love for your children is unlike any other feeling in the world. And until you have children, you don't know what it feels like. In 1994, my editors at the Times Magazine asked me to write an article about deaf culture. And I was very taken aback. I had always thought of deaf people as having an unfortunate disability. What a shame not to be able to hear. What could we do to help them and to change things? And then I went out into the deaf world. And I began spending time in deaf clubs and at deaf theater. I went to readings or performances of deaf poetry. And I discovered that for many deaf people, this thing of being deaf is what they have in common with others. And I discovered deaf culture. And I found that there was such a culture, and I found that it was a very attractive culture. I remember going to the Miss Deaf America contest, at which everyone complained because it was in Tennessee about the slurry Southern signing. And when I got to that, I remember having conversations with people and being at the National Association of the Deaf meeting that was taking place in conjunction with it. And at that meeting, there were people who were all in the midst of animated conversation, and the conversations were flying off the ends of their fingers. And I thought, you know, I wish I were deaf. Which is not to say that I wished I couldn't hear, because my hearing is very useful to me, but that I was in a society and I thought how wonderful it would be to be genuinely a part of that society and not a mere onlooker to it. And I saw that there was a certain poetry in those lives that was not present in mine, in the same way that there were experiences in mine to which they would have no access. And so I wrote about this notion of deaf identity, and I discovered that most deaf children are born to hearing parents, that those parents historically have mostly tried to get them to function in the hearing world, and that many of them have discovered deaf identity in adolescence or thereafter when they've met other signing deaf people, and it's come as a glorious liberation for them. And I thought how similar that was to the experience of gay people, who are generally born to straight parents, who generally try to get them to function in what they think of as the primary and real world, and how those gay people often take until adolescence to find the community in which they emerge into a sense of their condition as an identity. And then a friend of mine had a daughter who was a dwarf. And it turns out that most dwarfs are born to parents of average height. And I found this friend asking questions. Should I bring her up to think she's just like everyone else, but kind of short? Or should I somehow try to construct some sort of a dwarf identity for her? And as she narrated her bewilderment, I thought, here it is again. Here it is again, a situation in which a family that perceives itself to be more or less normal has a child who is in some striking way exceptional and trying to figure out how to negotiate and navigate that. And so I came up with the idea that there are really two kinds of identities out there. There are what I've called vertical identities, so one's ethnicity, one's nationality, frequently one's religion. These are things that parents tend to hand down to their children, things they tend to have in common with them. And you can argue that some of those identities are very difficult. You can say, despite the current presidency, and in the face of a great deal that's been in the news this year, that it is still easier to be a white person than to be a person of color in the United States of America. But nobody has suggested that we address that by curing those differences. Nobody is doing research to see how we can ensure that the next generation of children born to Asian or Latino or African American parents come out with blonde hair and blue eyes. And then there are what I've called horizontal identities. Horizontal because you can't learn them from your parents because you don't have them in common with your parents, and you therefore learn them from a peer group. So those are things like being gay, like being deaf, like being a dwarf, like having autism or Down syndrome or schizophrenia. They include things that are more socially constructed. Being a genius is one of them. I wrote about families bringing up children conceived in rape, families of people who committed crimes, and families of people who are transgender. And in all of those instances, the children have to be the ones who lead the way toward a definition of identity. And as I did this work, I was very struck by a contrast that I had not previously understood that was very illuminating and very liberating for me. And that was the contrast between love and acceptance. I realized, as I thought about it, that most parents love their children. We've all heard terrible stories of abuse or neglect, but most parents really do love their children. And they mostly love them pretty much from the beginning. But acceptance is a process, and it's a process that takes time. And it always takes time. It takes time even when your child doesn't have an extraordinary or exceptional identity. And it's an ongoing process. And when I saw that, I was able to arrive at a certain peace, because when my parents struggled with my being gay, I had angrily accused them of not really loving me. And this helped me to see that they had always loved me, but that they took a little while to accept me, and that it takes everyone a little while, and that all things considered, it didn't take them so very long. So I'll tell you about the few of the people who are in the book. And I'm going to start with Clinton Brown. When he was born with diastrophic dwarfism, the doctors told his parents that he would never learn their names, he would never be able to interact with them, that effectively there was no point in their taking him home from the hospital and they should leave him there to die quietly. And his mother said that she wanted to take her baby home and try, and if he just died and never knew them, at least she'd know that she'd done her best. So she took him home, and despite not having vast educational or financial resources, she found her way to the best doctor for the treatment of dwarfing conditions in the United States, Stephen Kopitz at Johns Hopkins. And she took Clinton down to see Dr. Kopitz, and in the course of his childhood, he had 30 major surgical procedures, some of which involved his being completely immobilized for periods of up to 2 months because they were spinal surgeries. And as a result of those surgeries, he actually now can walk. And while he was stuck in the hospital all that time, he figured there was nothing else much to do, so he might as well focus on his schoolwork. And he did, and he achieved academically at a level previously unknown in his family, and became, in fact, the first member of his family to go to college. And he went to college not far from where his parents lived on Long Island, and he had by that time learned to drive and had a specially fitted car that he was able to drive, and he joined a fraternity and was living on campus. And his mother called me one day, and she said, "I was driving home from work, and I went past a bar, and there was Clinton's car parked outside a bar." She said, and I thought to myself, he's 3 feet tall, they're 6 feet tall, 2 beers for them is 4 beers for him. She said, and I wanted to go in there and interrupt the whole thing. And then I knew I couldn't do that. So I just drove myself home and left 11 messages on his voicemail. She said, and then I thought, if someone had told me when he was born that my future worry would be that he would go drinking and driving with his college buddies, I'd have been so thrilled to have that problem. And I said to her, what do you think you did? What do you think you did that allowed someone with so bleak a prognosis to end up popular and charming and attractive and engaged and very much in the thick of life? And she said, what did I do? We loved him, that's all. Clinton just always had that light in him, and we were lucky enough to be the first to see it there. I was struck by those stories of acceptance, and I'm going to quote to you from one more magazine from the 1960s, the last one of this particular conversation, which is the Atlantic Monthly, also 1968, saying, "There is no reason to feel guilty about putting a Down syndrome baby away, whether it is put away in the sense of hidden in a sanitarium or in a more responsible, lethal sense. It is sad, yes, dreadful, but it carries no guilt. True guilt arises only from an offense against a person, and a Downs is not a person." We've had enormous changes in the way that we understand difference. The changes in the way we understand gayness are in the headlines all the time. But we have become altogether a more accepting society, more willing to recognize value in the diversity of our populations. Now, there are people with Down syndrome on television. In fact, someone I know who works with people with DS was in LA and had lunch with the woman who appeared on the television program Glee, and people were coming up to her and asking her for her autograph. And she said to me, she was a celebrity first and a person with a disability second. I never dreamed I would see such a day. As I've looked at all of these situations, I've been struck by the social progress. But I have also been struck by the medical progress. The cochlear implant means that people who have deafness, children born with deafness, have this device which is surgically implanted under their skin and attached to a transmitter, feeds sound information directly into the brain and bypasses the structure of the ear, and means that most children now born deaf in the United States are brought up as effectively hearing. There is a compound which is now being tested in humans, having worked well in mice, called BMN 111. It blocks the action of the gene that causes achondroplasia, the most common dwarfing condition. And the dwarf community feels that there will be no dwarfs like them at some point in the future. And there are blood tests that allow people to pick up genetic anomalies such as Down syndrome earlier and earlier than they ever did before. And I believe in the social progress that I've described, and I also believe in medical progress, but I find that they're often on a collision course and don't seem, each one, to have noticed the other. When I was looking at this resilience of parental love, I threw myself into this variety of situations, and in looking at parents of people who've committed crimes, I was struck by how much blame we still assign to those parents. We've stopped blaming overbearing mothers and passive fathers for their children's homosexuality. We've stopped blaming refrigerator mothers for their children's autism. But in crime, we still level that blame. And I thought, what is it like to try to preserve some feeling of love in the face of complete horror? And I went off to interview Tom and Sue Klebold, the parents of Dylan Klebold, who was one of the perpetrators of the Columbine massacre. And as I spent time with them, I was very much struck by the resilience of their love. I had to persuade them to talk to me. They didn't want to do it. And when they finally started talking, they were so full of their story that they couldn't stop telling it. And on the third day of the first weekend that I spent with them, Sunday night, we were all sitting around in the kitchen, utterly exhausted, 30 hours of interviews on tape. Sue was making dinner. And I said, if Dylan were here now, is there anything you'd want to ask him? And his father said, I sure would. I'd want to ask him what the hell he thought he was doing. And his mother looked at the floor, and she thought for a minute. And then she looked up and said, I would ask him to forgive me for being his mother and never knowing what was going on inside his head. And when she and I had dinner a few years later, and I reminded her of that conversation, we'd had many dinners in between, she said, when it first happened, I used to wish I had never had children. If I hadn't gone to Ohio State, I wouldn't have met Tom, these children wouldn't have existed, and this terrible thing wouldn't have happened. But over time, I've come to feel that I love the children I have so much that I don't want to imagine a life without them, even at the cost of this pain. When I say that, I'm speaking about my own pain, of course, not the pain of other people. But life is full of suffering, and this is mine. So while I know it would have been better for the world if Dylan had never been born, I've decided that it would not have been better for me. I was struck by a mother who could say that she doesn't wish away that child, but I'm struck by the fact that nobody wishes away their child, or very few people do in any case. And that if some glorious angel were to materialize here at the Kent School and offer everyone in this room who is a parent the chance to exchange whatever children they have for other, better children who are more attractive and more polite and perhaps even more intelligent, that all of us would cling to to the children we have and pray away that atrocious spectacle. There's a sociologist who said that we not only take care of our children because we love them, but also love them because we take care of them. That process of taking care is an intensely bonding process. And these children have in many instances required more care than any others. And it should be no surprise how strong the bond is, even when it's painful. As one mother said at the funeral of a child who had died through caregiver neglect, a child with very, very severe disabilities who had never walked or spoken, she said, "Let me bury here the rage I feel to have been twice robbed. Once of the child I wanted, and once of the son I loved." It was in the course of doing all of this research that I decided to have children myself. And various people expressed astonishment and said, "How can you, in the middle of this book about everything that can go wrong, have decided to undertake this adventure?" And I had to say over and over again, but it's not really a book about everything that can go wrong. It's actually a book about how much joy there can be even when everything goes wrong. And rather than scaring me off parenthood, it has propelled me toward it. When I try to describe my family, it always seems to take a long time and be complicated, so this is the most condensed version. My husband is the biological father of 2 children with some lesbian friends in Minneapolis. One of my best friends from college had got divorced but wanted children, and she and I have a daughter who lives with her mother in Texas. And then my husband and I wanted to have a child together, and so we have our son, George, of whom I am the biological father. We had an egg donor, and our surrogate was Laura, the lesbian mother of his 2 biological children. So now that my daughter's mother has a man in her life as well, it's 6 parents of 4 children in 3 states. And the day that our son George was born was, of course, a essentially joyful day, and he came out, and it was all very thrilling, and we were embarking on this great new adventure. And he came late in the evening, and the next morning the pediatrician came in, and she said she was concerned. And I said, "Oh." And she said, I'm concerned because he's not extending his legs correctly." And I said, "Oh." And she said, "That could indicate that he has severe neurological damage." And I said, "What?" And she said, "And also insofar as he is extending them, he's doing so asymmetrically, which suggests the possibility of a mass in his brain. And additionally, by the way, he has a very large head, and we ought to check him for hydrocephalus." And so on that first day of this child's life, we took this baby, this infant less than 24 hours old, off to have all of these tests, to have a CAT scan and an MRI, and to be jabbed with needles for an arterial blood draw. And I thought to myself how I had been writing this book all about the meaning that could be found in bringing up children with disabilities and differences, and I didn't want to join their number. And after we had had the whole day of that, and I had felt more and more and more anxious, I began to think that what I was experiencing in not wanting to join their number was the sense that my child had an illness. But because of what I'd been writing, I realized it would also be an identity if he had any of those things. And I suddenly realized that if it was going to be his identity, it would in some measure be mine. And I heard my mother's voice saying, "The love for your children is unlike any other feeling in the world, and until you have children, you don't know what it feels like." At the end of 6 hours of this, the pediatrician called us in and told us the scans were all clear and that George was now extending his leg just fine. And when I asked her what she thought had been going on in the morning, she said he had probably had a cramp. I think children had no doubt ensnared me in that moment when I connected fatherhood with loss, which I probably wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't been in the thick of the research I was doing. While I was doing that research, I both admired and at some level disbelieved the parents I talked to. I thought they were trying to talk themselves into something, binding themselves with these miserable children and trying to breed identity out of their agony. And on that day in the hospital with George, I suddenly realized that my research had built me something of a plank, and that I was ready to join them on their ship. Thank you very much.
Help me understand this notion of identity in a historical way. In other words, as you were talking, I suddenly thought, did they have these kind of support groups or peer groups 60 years ago? Is it, in some way, is this notion of identity somehow made possible by the advent of things like Alcoholics Anonymous and the idea of the support group, right? Or the internet? Could we even be having this conversation 60 years ago, or was it just, were these ideas just simply not supported by the material reality in which we think we will then live?
People's awareness of identity as an issue has vastly increased over recent years, and some of these identities have been really reified as identities by the internet and the access it gives people to other people with a like condition. But deaf people, for example, were sent to deaf schools already in the 18th century, in which they were with other deaf people who were also signers, and they learned to sign, and they developed a sense that they were part of a society and a culture. And I don't know that they would have used the word identity, but the experience of identity was, I think, very significant sort of all the way back then. Dwarfs who were often in circuses and so on, also had groups of other dwarfs whom they knew. So people have always, to some degree, sought out people who were like them. And there is evidence that actually in Persia under Darius, I think, that there was an area where many deaf people came together, and there was education provided for them, and the spread, in fact, of a certain form of deafness is traced back to that concentration of deaf people. So it's a concept which has evolved, but it is not a new one.
That's remarkable because Darius was actually the emperor, or whatever the Persian ruler would have been called, who first sort of acted on the principles of religious and ethnic tolerance as well. So that's something I came across in my research on Jewish history, so that's fascinating. Do you think that the relationship between vertical and horizontal identity is in fact changing in our time? In other words, is horizontal identity becoming more important? Are we slipping the bonds of our ethnic, national, religious heritage and forming these other horizontal identities, not just around illness flipped to identity, but other kinds of identity in ways that we never have before?
I don't know that we're actually moving away from those identities that have existed for a longer time. But I think we have lived in the sort of century of rights movements. And I think the women's suffrage movement and later feminism led to certain forms of liberation, that the civil rights movement then borrowed from the suffrage movement, and that those movements, which were based on vertical identities, had to come first because those vertical identities had received more positive reinforcement from earliest childhood for the people who had them. In the wake of those triumphs and in the wake of that advancement, the gay rights movement came along and was the first, I would say, of the horizontal identity movements really to gain a lot of steam. Deaf rights came shortly thereafter, the larger disability rights discourse, autism rights. I think they're sort of coming fast and furious. I think as more and more kinds of identity go from being utterly stigmatized to being accepted and in some instances even celebrated, that people are starting to think, who am I, what am I like, and how can I construct a life and also a world in which the way that I am is seen not as some cloud of darkness, but rather as a beacon of hope.
Can I ask you to update the story of your son, because the one you're raising together with your husband, and I know from a conversation we had in the green room that he is now 6, and I wonder if you've had other moments in which you've had to think about your own relationship with his difference or distinctiveness in any way, not necessarily as extreme perhaps as an illness, but do you feel that you're negotiating that on a daily basis or not?
I think every parent is negotiating that on a daily basis at one level or another. I have tried to persuade him that the kind of music I like is better than the kind of music he seems to gravitate toward, even at 6, and to get him to stop watching the Lego Chima videos and talking about them, and instead to be engaged with things of higher quality, many of which he does connect to and that he does really like. I mean, it's a matter, I think, always of trying to figure out how can I be not only a good father in some large abstract way, but how can I be a good father to this child? And to what degree should I recognize his having an independent point of view in which he actually likes some things I don't and doesn't like things that I do? And to what extent is he young and naive and needs some help and education in forming his relationship to food or music or art or the mind or anything else? And that's a balance that I feel I and my husband are always trying to strike. I mean, he doesn't seem so very different. He's very, he's an easy child, at least an easy child for us to love and to be happy with. So I don't feel that I'm trying to radically to change the way that he thinks and does things. But I think the responsibility of parenthood, maybe this is a better answer, the responsibility of parenthood is binary. It is to change your children. If you don't change your children, you're neglecting them. You have to educate them, you have to teach them some manners, you have to give them a moral compass. There's a lot you have to do as a parent to change your child. And you have to accept and celebrate your child for who he or she is and make your child feel really secure and certain that who he or she fundamentally is absolutely terrific by you. And some things clearly need to be changed, and some things clearly are just to be celebrated, and a lot falls in a gray area in the middle. And I think it's the negotiation of that gray area and figuring out, is this something to change? Is this something to accept? Is this something to celebrate? That, I think, is, in some ways, kind of one of the central challenges of parenthood.
That's wonderful, thank you. We are at the 15-minute mark, so that means that I want to open the floor for questions. I urge you to make your questions short and make sure that they are questions. So you know the drill. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, gentleman in a pink shirt, I think I can say.
So Jim Fruchterman, and my nonprofit serves hundreds of thousands of disabled kids, and they fall into two rough groups: blind kids and kids with physical disabilities, where the movement has been very active, the disability rights movement, and those kids with hidden disabilities, kids with dyslexia. The dyslexia and learning difference movement is now talking about taking a leaf out of the gay rights movement and coming out of the closet, because up till now, hiding their disability has actually been to their benefit if they can pull it off. So is that something that you've explored?
Well, I actually have dyslexia myself, and I came out about it in the book that I wrote. And it was kind of striking. I have dyslexia. My mother, who had been an educator, worked very closely with me when I was little, endlessly on reading. She certainly didn't cure my dyslexia. I mostly now have dysgraphia, and I read slowly, but she helped me enormously in learning how to cope with it. And I sometimes felt that that set the stage for the perception in our household that with some discipline you could overcome any neurological abnormality. And that was the sort of the gay conversation. I think there is a sense more and more that people are looking at any of these conditions and trying to figure out if this isn't something that can be cured, or if this is something for which the cure is traumatic and horrific to a disproportionate degree, then what are the ways that we can accommodate it? And I think the changing of rules around people who have got learning disabilities and so on has been tremendous, and is allowing many people who, when I was a kid, would have just done badly and been at the bottom of the class, actually to do well and succeed. So their having an identity is helpful in that they're being with other kids, but what's really helpful is a society that in general has said what we would like is for everyone in the society to succeed. And if the way to ensure that that happens is to figure out these accommodations and restructure the way we address children who are different in these ways, then it's worth doing it, even if it takes us some effort and expense.
would you care to comment, on the transgender teen, the socialization and the future?
Well, that's a sort of large and open question. I think that we have increasingly come to understand that many people who are transgender from an early stage, that there are children who really will suffer from various kinds of depression and anxiety if they're forced to live in their natal gender, in whom all of those signs of distress will lift if they're allowed to live in the gender that they know themselves to be. And there is a sort of question there, which interestingly I think correlates with the question that you've just asked, which is that for a long time, transgender people were mostly born of one gender and then chose to live as another gender, and they remained in that binary, and they mostly didn't want anyone to know that they had made a sort of crossing of that binary. Now we live in a society in which the norms of gender have become more fluid and more roughly defined, and in which people who are transgender may very well wish to identify as transgender people. And I've met people who are outspoken about being transgender who then over a period of time feel as though actually they just want to settle into quiet lives in the gender they've assumed and the marriage they're in. And I've met people who are quite closeted and anxious who then, when they're older, decide to become trans activists because they think it's important for a direct response to be made. I think the acceptance of teenagers who are trans is tremendous. I think it's sometimes confused. I think it's important to recognize that there are many people who are gender variant who are not actually transgender. But I think it's good for people to feel as though the options are there, and for people to feel increasingly as though they can talk about who they are and indeed be who they are without the risk of being attacked. Now, that tends to be true in many instances in the sort of demographic that I think is largely represented in this room. In the course of the research I did, I spent time with people who are living in small towns, in rural areas, in a different part of the United States, whose children had been tortured. One woman who had people threatening to murder her child and had to run away from the town in the south where she'd lived for many years and worked as a teacher to hide her child because local Klansmen were threatening to shoot the child and were extremely violent in what they put forward. So there is social progress. It is still, to some degree, regional, and I hope that it will spread more widely.
Could you repeat what you did on your TED Talk about what your child said to you? I just thought that was so wonderful.
Oh, at my birthday? Yes. Oh, well, that was a very, very lovely moment. It was my 50th birthday, almost 2 years ago, and George began pulling on my husband's sleeve and said that he wanted to make a toast. And John said, "George, you can't make a toast, you're 4. Only Grandpa and Uncle David and I are making toast today." But George apparently insisted, and John said he didn't want to see any sort of a meltdown happen in the middle of the party, and he finally said, "All right, we'll go up there, and you can just ask everyone for their attention before I do my toast." And so George went up, and he got behind the microphone. There were about 150 people there, and he said very loudly, "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please?" And everyone sort of turned around a little bit startled, and he said, "I'm glad it's Daddy's birthday. I'm glad we all get cake. And Daddy, if you were little, I'd be your friend." One of the high points of my whole life. So thank you for giving me a chance to tell the story again.
So that's one of the best stories ever, and I'm so glad you were asked to repeat it. But it leads perfectly to my question, so thank you for asking him to do that, which is, having grown up not having perhaps the peer group you might have wished, does that alter your choice of friends, or do you try in any way to influence the peer group of your own children? And are you trying to guess what that would be ideal or most accepting for them?
I mean,
we sent George to a school which has not had gay families previously, and where we are, so far as I know, the only gay parents. And various people said, oh, don't you think you should send him to a school where his experience will be more the norm and where there will be lots of gay parents? And I said I thought we should send him to a school that seemed really to want him and that he seemed really to like, and where the parents seemed congenial and like the sort of people we liked, and that their sexuality wasn't really central. And so far, he doesn't appear to have had any social difficulties that are attached to his coming from our household in particular. But we have also made a point of ensuring that we have other gay families that we know with children of the same age, so that if he does feel that, he has access to them. I don't want to sort of cushion him from, I do want to cushion him from, assault and from real cruelty. I don't want him to grow up in an artificially constructed world. We have lots of gay friends. We have more non-gay friends. There are more non-gay people in the world. We have a broad range of friends. I don't know what the bases would be for any form of social exclusion for him, and we would certainly try to cushion him from that. But I don't feel like he needs to be wrapped up in bubble wrap. I don't feel like the structure of our family is so different as to alienate him from his peers.
Thank you, Andrew. So you said something at the beginning that was quite interesting. You said that there's a looming almost tension between increasing social acceptance of difference and then medical progress that can ameliorate it. Can you talk more about that, and specifically, does the existence of a treatment, say for dwarfism or autism, which may happen in our working lifetime, does that create an obligation to treat, and what is lost if that is done?
Well, that is a big and important and complicated question. I think that what we have to do is to figure out which of the conditions that we're looking at, what is the upside of these conditions continuing to exist, and what is the downside of someone having to deal with them. And in many instances, I think there is a loss to society if we see the disappearance of these cultures. I think human diversity is extremely rich and important, and that a more homogeneous society is not a better society. But many of these conditions entail a certain degree of suffering, and we have to address the suffering. Now, what I have ended up with as a sort of construction for that question is the notion that essentially each of these conditions involves two kinds of suffering. It involves socially determined suffering, which comes about because people are prejudiced against people who are different and disabled, or because the communications structures that are necessary for deaf people to interact in the world aren't present. These are things which actually are socially determined. And my point of view is, if the problem is a social problem, it should be treated in the society and not by curing the person. On the other hand, many of these conditions also involve a certain amount of inherent pain. For deaf people, perhaps it's not being able to hear music. For someone who's a dwarf, there's often a lot of trouble with spinal stenosis and other complicating aspects of dwarfism. I don't see any reason for us to insist that people live in personal physical pain because we want a diverse society. That seems to me to be wrong. So the balance is to figure that out. But there are many conditions which function one way for one person and another way for another person. So I've met people with autism for whom it is a cherished identity, who are in a community of autistic people and who have a very rich experience of autism. And I have seen children with no language who are banging their head on a wall in the corner and who are clearly very, very unhappy. And for many people, it changes. I mean, when I was a kid, I thought that being gay was the worst thing and I wished it weren't so. And in my adulthood, I wouldn't give up the life I have and the marriage I have and the children I have for some other hypothetical life, even though I know that hypothetical life might have been somewhat easier. So again, it's a very nuanced question, but I think really the central question is the inherent pain versus the social pain.
Andrew, you have written about and talked about extraordinary examples of parental love for these special children. And what I'd like to know is about the level of support that exists for parents who struggle with the issue of being a parent to a very, very special problematic child. And out there in the middle of the country in places that aren't, major metropolitan areas, what kind of advice can we get?
Well, the first thing that I'd want to emphasize is that this is a very truncated talk based on a long book. There are many parents who don't actually have these rich and satisfying experiences of children with difference. And even for the parents who do, it's often a difficult and agonizing journey to get there. So it's not as though, most people finding out that their child has deafness or dwarfism or autism or schizophrenia say, oh, how fantastic, now we're going to be in this glorious community. That's not the take, and I wouldn't want anyone to walk away with that. There are supports for people in any of the areas that I've written about, and again, the internet has horrible misinformation and bizarre hate groups, but it has also allowed people much more rapidly to find other people with whom they have these things in common. But I think it's important to understand that many families, most families, go through a process if they're going to get to acceptance at all, and that it's very difficult. And also to understand that what kind of supports are there around the family will make an enormous difference to their experience. I mean, if you have a child who has a difference or a disability, and you have the economic wherewithal and the health insurance, whatever else you need, so that you know your child is getting the best possible treatment, so that you know that you can get someone to take care of your child if you are unable to do so for some reason, who will do enough of the caretaking so that you can get some sleep and go on with your own life. It's much easier to find all of what's wonderful and gratifying about having this child with a challenging difference than it is if you are barely able to hold it together and are living in a double-wide trailer and struggling to meet the rent bill and just can't be there and can't do it and feel your child is suffering and you're helpless in the face of it. So that makes an enormous amount of difference, just somebody's economic position. Though, of course, some people who are more economically privileged are more likely to have a problem, are more likely to be perfectionistic and may rail against the condition more. But in general, I think the more privilege you have, the better off you are, and the more community you have, the better off you are. To be able to say to someone else, gee, we had this problem, what did you do when that happened, makes a huge difference. And the isolation of some of the families, I mean, some of the ones who are in the book, but the ones who've written to me since the book has come out, the people who say, I've never talked to anyone else who understood what I was going through, that isolation for a huge number of people scattered all over the country is a terrible, terrible burden. Thank you.